Welcome to the Communist Labor Party podcast. Here, we feature presentations and educational pieces we feel are important in the fight against capitalism. In this episode, we return to Sophia Burns of RATPAC and Max Morgan of the CLP and the first half of the question and answer portion of their presentation on the strategy of dual power. This audio is taken from a presentation at a regional Red Skull educational summit the CLP hosted in April of 2016.
All right, so questions, comments. I saw that, Caitlin, you raised your hand and you didn't. Okay, so, all right, Daniel.
Max, at one point you mentioned that not all dual power institutions have to be founded with the idea of countering a parallel capitalist. Not all working class institutions need to be founded with the intention of countering a existing capitalist institution. What I was understanding, though, this is like halfway between a question and a comment, is that any functional dual power institution is going to be providing a necessary function that didn't exist before, or was being provided very inefficiently. And that in itself is countering an existing institution, either one that was providing the service but not doing it well, or it wasn't being provided at all. And by filling that gap, there's a power base that is now being created to counter the lack of that. Is that, I could probably phrase that better if I had time. Does that make sense? Or are you think, or is there, when you said that, were you thinking of like particular possibilities where there's a dual power structure that isn't actually countering anything, but it's still doing something useful?
That is an ideal but not necessary quality for dual power institution. You don't have to be countering an existing oppressive institution. So the thing with alternative institutions versus counter institutions, an alternative institution is providing for a need that that is not being provided for or is not being provided for effectively by the existing system. And a counter institution is something that is a power directly in opposition to something that is bad. So the Black Lives Matter campaign, organized as an ongoing activist force, is a dual power institution in opposition to the direct state violence against communities of color. It is a counter institution. In that sense, that it is countering aggression from the state or oppression from the state, where an alternative institution is providing for a need, something that we need. Though a dual power institution can be easily categorized into one of those two fields, it does not have to be necessarily something that the state is not giving or is not giving very effectively. It could be something the state does really well, like like the protection of private property, though who knows why we would want to do that.
A fire station.
Yeah, like a fire station. I mean, like, well, they for the most part do a pretty good job of doing emergency management when it is not in their interest to allow a community to be destroyed. But in general, the bourgeois state does a pretty good job with emergency management. If we provided our own emergency management services, that would not be an alternative institution that is replacing something the state does very poorly. It would be simply a way of making sure that our own interests are looked after by our own people and developing a power base and a point of consolidation for assets that we already have. So just to give an example of something that doesn't quite meet that definition, but is still a dual power institution.
And, you know, like Max was saying, it's not a question of meeting a need efficiently. Like, yeah, there are some things that the capitalist state and capitalism can do pretty efficiently, but whether it's being done efficiently by or on behalf of the ruling class or not, a second relevant point from our perspective is whether it is being done by and on behalf of the ruling class under the control of the ruling class whose interests are against ours, or whether it's being done by, working disabled and oppressed people, whether it's controlled in that democratic participatory way so that it is of, by, and for, the working class, working disabled and oppressed people. But yeah, the difference between a counter institution and an alternative institution, think of it like this. Starting a union in a capitalist workplace is a counter institution. Ideally, that union is, controlled by its working class members and advocates in their interest. If it's healthy, it's a working class institution. And what it exists to do is oppose the power that the capitalist class has in the workplace. An alternative institution, on the other hand, is a co-op. It addresses those same needs, but it does it separate from the existing structure. The point of a co-op isn't, to go and picket, Fred Meyers to demand a higher wage for the employees there. What a co-op does is it builds its own grocery store or whatever. It's a question of an institution that's there to oppose existing power structures or an institution that's there to build something entirely new. And the philosophy of dual power says that we got to do both. And, the basic program of the CLP is that we don't just do the oppositional, but we also do the constructive, and we view those as mutually supporting and both necessary. Like that is our reason for existing. If we only wanted to do oppositional stuff, then there's plenty of groups out there that we could have affiliated to. But we're interested in doing the oppositional and the constructive.
Okay, so I have a comment followed by a quick question, if that's all right. So what really intrigues and excites me about dual power style is how it can be used as a mechanism for building class consciousness as well as building those institutions. Something that comes to mind as an example from my old union, the GTFF, is that's sort of an oppositional organization that built sort of like an alternative organization in the GTFF Health and Welfare Trust. So this is the group that runs the health insurance plan basically for the workers, and it's entirely controlled by members of the union. And I still remember this really awesome interaction I had with a member once who had like some kind of a weird paperwork or a financial snafu and like missed a deadline for filing for their coverage or something, and like sent in a letter to our trust board like just appealing us to like roll back that date and let them get their coverage retroactively. And we were like, okay. And like this person came up to me at a union meeting like a couple of weeks later, and he was like, you guys just said yes. And I was like, well, yeah, we looked it over and it wasn't going to break the bank or anything. And like, you had a shitty situation. And like, we're there to like keep that from turning into a disaster. And he was like, I really didn't expect that. I'm like, you've never been in a health organization run entirely by your coworkers before. I'm not surprised. And so, there was no discussion of Marxism here. There was no discussion of class in an explicit way. But this is somebody who walked away from an interaction with an institution like this being like, wow, the only time I was treated like a human freaking being by the health system is when it was my coworkers running it, right? So that's just one example of how these things can start building in people the idea that their class is something that has interests allied with them, and that things are different when their class is running things.
Steve's comment about dual power institutions being co-opted made me think of Mondragon, Spain. I don't know how many people. Yeah, okay, some for other people. That was initially a very successful project in the Basque region, where an entire city elected to become a co-op. So absolutely everything in the city was owned by the workers and was largely self-sufficient. And over time, over decades, as far as I can tell, that there wasn't a concerted effort to disrupt Mondragon. It's like, the Spanish government didn't particularly go after them. There wasn't a coherent capitalist strategy to disrupt the co-op, but over a long period of time, interacting with the capitalist economy, eroded their ability to sustain the structures that they had built up. And in order to continue operating at all, they had to make their own concessions. Again, like completely worker-owned. So these were the people, worker-owned businesses deciding to make these concessions to create hierarchical management structures, to create a wage system, to start operating businesses as a profit, until they're basically like they went from like a proletarian-run city to something like one of these Russian courtocracies. And I think it could be very useful to study, to make a concerted effort at some level in the party, to study exactly what went on and figure out how from that to try to make more resilient as institutions.
Actually, that's something that Anne and I have discussed explicitly, is the Mondragon example of how do you stop, because the economic forces that incentivize that sort of behavior, and I'm not, in the Mondragon example, I'm not entirely sure that they were forced to make those decisions. Those decisions were incentivized by the profit motive because they were interacting in the market. As I understand it, Mondragon is still outrageously profitable, and the people who have like a full membership are get preferential hours and a significantly higher income than the people that they are hiring to exploit. So they've simply become a cabal of bosses. At least that's my understanding of the situation. And I was talking to Anne about this, and one of the ways that you can address that specific concern is create a parallel institution for the workers. So suppose you have particularly an industrial co-op that is currently in the process of managing a factory and producing commodities for a capitalist market. So you have the ownership of the co-op is collectively owned by the workers, and collectively managed by the workers, and then but they are still under the economic incentive to hire someone else to do the work and become a cabal of bosses as the business expands to support them. You can undermine that incentive by creating a parallel political body of workers in the form of a union for your co-op shop. So you have you basically, instead of having what is effectively a very large business partnership created under the auspices of something like an IWW closed shop, where the union, not necessarily the union, it could be the workers directly, are own the business, but where the union and the business are parallel entities with membership overlap, in which would create a situation where if they were to hire new workers to exploit so they could become a cabal of bosses, those workers are inducted into the union, where they now have political power as voting members to influence the decisions of that body over whether or not the business is administered that way. And what you do is create so the cabal of bosses situation is something that developed over time. You have the people who've been around for a long time accumulating power because it is in their interest to do so. But if you create that parallel institution, you create a counter pressure. You're adding an element to this dialectical system, in that now every worker in the union has an incentive in preventing those changes from happening in order to maintain their equal share in what is happening. And that also creates a layer of density from the dual power aspect. And now you have two institutions immediately in parallel to each other. And in order to de-radicalize one, you must de-radicalize both. And really, I mean, if we're going to bury the Okrana in a math problem.
And if I could say just very briefly about the example of Mondragon specifically, Mondragon never had that type of, parallel working class political structure. They very deliberately did not have that structure. One of the reasons why the fascist government, Franco's fascist government, tolerated Mondragon is because the founders of the Mondragon co-ops were very, very explicit that they didn't want any connection to working class political organization. They actually, sold it to the fascist authorities as this is an alternative to socialism. This is something that workers can get involved in so that they don't get involved in the kinds of things that, you just dealt with in the Spanish Republic. It was sold as something that would very, very deliberately eschew any sort of political connection or, union type stuff, specifically so that it could co-opt those political impulses into something that would be acceptable to the fascist government.
So we had a comment and sort of a question from Maddie online. Maddie says, I don't know if you feel dual power is really just a stop measure, because within the next 200 years or so, we're going to have an ecological and societal collapse. Not saying that dual power can't work or isn't helpful, but creating a new means of how to live seems to be pretty high priority in light of climate change and teetering on the edge of capitalism's collapse. So I guess where does dual power fit in with the climate issue that we're facing?
I'd say that 200 years is a very generous timeline. We've got closer to 50 to make a serious dent before everything gets all fucky. Dual power is not an institutional practice to save the human race from industrialization. We're going to need state power to do that. Dual power is a vehicle for the proletariat as a collective class in North America or anywhere else in the world to get that state power to be able to do what is necessary to actually mitigate the damage of climate change and see if we can't get the climate and our industrial society back on a track towards some sort of equilibrium. Whether or not that is possible is an open point of conjecture. I believe that it is. Many people believe that it is not. But in the meantime, we might as well try, because the other option is to just throw up our hands and say, fuck it, I guess we're going to die, which is not, it's really just not emotionally gratifying to me. I don't know if that's enough of a reason to do it, but I'm gonna go down swinging, bare minimum. But that, yeah, it's that dual power is not a way for the working class to save industrial civilization in the face of ecological collapse. Dual power is a methodology for the working class to seize state power, establish a proletarian state, and then with that proletarian state power, we may be able to enact the programs necessary to preserve industrial civilization in a changing environment.
And also, just right quick, so once the shit like really, really, really hits the fan, ecologically, I think that it'll be a whole lot easier for, working disabled and oppressed communities to survive a little bit better if there is, a strong network of dual power type institutions that are focused not just on exercising political power, but on meeting like specific material needs. I think that, let's look at the food system, for instance, let's look at the food system. The capitalist food system as it exists is, I think, way more vulnerable to ecological crisis than our society ought to be comfortable with. But the nature of dual power organizing, the nature of how it intrinsically has to work, means that instead of, these massive top-down resource squandering, agribusiness and distribution and grocery, systems, that it's going to mean, okay, so here's your worker-owned cooperative grocery that's local, and there's another one 2 towns over, and there's another one there and there and there. And then, here's your cooperative urban farm, and here's your co-op not urban farm. And they're distributing the stuff that they grow to, the co-op groceries around. And simply because it is literally impossible, to go about a dual power strategy without starting small, starting local, and then building those networks from there eventually, the network's getting bigger and bigger. That's going to mean that there's more local, more resilience into those communities. And, the participatory and democratic side of it too means that, it's way easier to say we need to do whatever we can to mitigate the problems that climate change is going to cause us. And since, we generally agree on that, we hold the power in this institution so we can implement that, as opposed to, I would say either, existing capitalist systems or some more conventional social democratic or whatever state-owned grocery chain. It would be a little easier for that to adopt, resilient practices, but with the dual power model, I feel like to a large extent it's built into it.
And that was Sophia Burns of RATPAC and Max Morgan of the CLP, ending the first half of the Q&A session of their presentation on the strategy of dual power. The process of establishing and networking institutions run directly by workers to take away reliance on capitalism. If you enjoy this content, please like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast for more revolutionary presentations, commentary, and workshops. This has been the CLP Podcast. Thank you for listening. Ending the first half of the Q&A session of their presentation on the strategy of dual power.